Okay, let's unpack this. Today, we're diving deep into a topic that's, well, it's not just dominating headlines, it's actively reshaping our societies. We're talking about the evolution of authoritarian populism in the United States. We'll be looking at its profound economic consequences, the intricate web of media manipulation that often comes with it, and its undeniable impact on democratic processes. We've pulled together a really rich stack of sources, a deep historical research, political analyses, economic reports, expert insights, basically trying to give you a shortcut to being truly well informed. Our mission really is to cut through the noise. We want to reveal what's most important in this crucial narrative and hopefully spark a few aha moments for you along the way.
Indeed. And our goal here isn't just to cover what has happened, but to really get into why it matters. We want to provide that broader context, the implications. We'll be connecting the dots between historical trajectories and the challenges we see today, inviting you, the listener, to think critically about the complex forces at play. We'll explore some central questions. I mean, how deeply rooted are these political currents, really? How have economic shifts fueled them? And maybe most importantly, what are the subtle and sometimes not so subtle ways our information environments are being reshaped?
Right. And to really understand the present, the sources suggest we have to start at the beginning. So our first deep dive chapter will explore the historical underpinnings of authoritarian populism in the U.S. And it seems, according to these sources, what we see today is far from a new phenomenon. It's more like a continuously refined strategy stretching way back through American history.
The theoretical underpinnings of authoritarian populism in the U.S.
Exactly. To truly understand modern authoritarian populism, we absolutely have to recognize its deep historical lineage. Our sources indicate that rather than being some recent political anomaly, it's perhaps best understood as, and this is a direct quote, an extension of settler colonial white supremacy,
Wow.
whose protagonists continuously refine their strategies for sustaining political power.
hmm
So this perspective suggests that the very foundation of how power was acquired and maintained in the U.S. played a huge role in shaping these currents. They just adapted and evolved over centuries.
That's a really strong claim, an extension of settler colonial white supremacy. Help me unpack that. What does that mean in practice? How far back are we talking? Are we talking about the very formation of the country itself? And how does that connect with something like manifest destiny, which, often gets a more heroic telling?
Well, it means tracing these patterns of power right back to the nation's earliest days. The historical research we've looked at points directly to the settlement of the American West, driven by manifest destiny, as a truly foundational period. And this narrative, it wasn't just about justifying physical expansion, right? It enshrined a specific Christian moral ethic. And, as some sources describe it, it saw European settlers actually become white through the very process of displacing Native Americans.
Huh. Become white. That's a striking phrase.
It is. It was a powerful ideological construct that defined who belonged, who was civilized, and who was, well, othered. It essentially forged a specific worldview where the subjugation of existing populations was often framed as divinely ordained progress. So this initial period really established a critical blueprint for how power would later be consolidated and how societal hierarchies would be justified.
So this wasn't just physical expansion, it was like a whole system of belief and economic interest completely intertwined. What kind of class structures came out of that, and how did they keep that God and country narrative going?
Precisely. This period established what the sources call an agrarian capitalist class. Essentially, a powerful group whose wealth and influence grew directly from controlling huge amounts of land and, crucially, the labor on it. And alongside this, they embedded that narrative of God and country, intrinsically linking it to hardship, expansion, and dominion over land and people.
So the narrative wasn't just about faith.
No, not just about faith. It was a potent tool. It was used to validate aggressive territorial expansion and, frankly, the violent dispossession of indigenous populations. It laid an ideological groundwork, establishing patterns of exclusion and hierarchy that, according to these analyses, you can still see echoes of today. It's a compelling argument for how deeply embedded economic interests and religious justifications became in the American identity. They created this powerful, self-reinforcing ideology that would later be adapted for different political ends. So that God and country idea, in this specific context, wasn't just benign. It was really a call to action that justified immense suffering for anyone deemed an outsider.
Okay, so the core insight from this period then is how these early national narratives like manifest destiny and God and country weren't just historical footnotes. They were powerful mechanisms that basically created a blueprint for defining insiders and outsiders. And you're saying we see that tactic adapted throughout history to consolidate power.
That's exactly the argument. It's about understanding how let's call it the DNA of these early American expansions, deeply connecting land, identity, and power, really laid the groundwork for later political mobilizations. It established this precedent that power could be legitimately gained and sustained by defining an in-group against an out-group, often using narratives of divine right or economic necessity.
Okay, so starting from those deep historical roots, we then see a critical shift emerge around the New Deal era. Our sources indicate that the modern conservative political movement, which often aligns with these authoritarian populist tendencies, actually predates the 1960s civil rights era backlash we often hear about. Can you explain how its roots are found in the, quote, businessmen reaction against the New Deal?
Yes, absolutely. And this reaction, it wasn't just a simple disagreement over economic policy. According to the historical accounts we've reviewed, it was a fundamental clash over the role of government and, importantly, the distribution of power within society. The New Deal, with its expansion of government programs, worker protections, support for collective bargaining, all of that was perceived by certain powerful economic interests as a direct threat.
A threat to their control.
A threat to their control and their established order, yes. These sources argue that this anti-New Deal sentiment was really a pivotal moment.
I can imagine powerful business elites being unhappy with regulations or new taxes, sure. But you mentioned it was intensely practical. What exactly were they so worried about? And what methods did they start looking for to, as the source says, contain working class struggle?
Well, think about it from their perspective. Take, for example, the powerful agricultural growers in California, which the sources focus on quite a bit. They looked at the New Deal and saw a profound challenge to their traditional dominance over labor. Their concern was deeply practical. The New Deal was empowering workers and farmers. It was giving them a voice, giving them leverage through things like collective bargaining rights and social safety nets.
Things we take for granted now, some of them.
Some, yes. And these growers, who were accustomed to having near absolute control over their labor force, they saw this as a dangerous erosion of their power. And according to the sources, they explicitly sought new methods of containing working-class struggle, add quote, quote. Their fear wasn't just some philosophical opposition to big government. It was a real concern that the balance of power was shifting, that labor might become as strong as capital, which, directly threatened their bottom line and their entire way of life.
Right, so this wasn't just about resisting specific policies in the short term. It was about a long-term strategy to shape the whole political landscape. How effective were they? Did these efforts, carry on across generations?
The sources strongly suggest this reaction was instrumental, truly instrumental, in shaping conservative success throughout the latter half of the 20th century. It involved developing innovative tactics, really moving beyond just traditional lobbying into more direct, more ideological forms of influence. And no, this wasn't some spontaneous uprising. It was described as a meticulously planned and sustained effort, often supported and shaped by influential families.
Ah, so there's continuity there.
A remarkable continuity of power and strategy across generations, yes. These families provided not just the financial backing, which was considerable, but also continuity of vision. They cultivated these intellectual and political networks that proved highly effective in achieving their aims over the long haul.
Okay, so the big takeaway here seems to be that the anti-New Deal sentiment among certain business classes was fundamentally about political power and social control, maybe even more than just economics. And it set this crucial precedent for how economic elites could mobilize to protect their interests, almost like creating a playbook for future conservative movements.
Precisely. It demonstrated a proactive, strategic pursuit of new ways to contain working-class influence and shape public opinion whenever their established power felt threatened.
So with the genesis of this movement, the sources talk about sophisticated tactical innovations. What exactly does that mean? You mentioned things like pro-free market think tanks and even propaganda via church-based radio networks pioneered out in California. Can you flesh those out a bit?
Certainly. And these weren't random developments, you have to understand. They were deliberate strategic investments aimed at building a powerful ideological infrastructure. Take the pro-free market think tanks, for instance. Their role was to provide the intellectual justification for specific policies, framing them within this free market ethos, often presenting economic theories almost as universal truths.
Giving it academic legitimacy.
Exactly. And then simultaneously, you had these church-based radio networks offering a direct, often very emotionally resonant channel to reach a wide and, importantly, receptive audience. They frequently blended economic arguments with moral and spiritual ones. This allowed for a really powerful, multifaceted appeal that reached far beyond traditional political discourse.
Wow, that's a potent combination, the sort of intellectual justification from the think tanks and the emotional appeal through the radio. How did these tactics specifically aim to, quote, tap into resentments among white voters? What kind of political economic agendas were they trying to push?
Well, the sources are quite clear that these efforts were specifically designed not just to articulate political economic agendas favorable to these business interests, but, crucially, to tap into existing resentments among white voters. It was a strategic effort to mobilize a specific segment of the population. They appealed to existing grievances, often tying economic anxieties explicitly to cultural and racial fears.
So it wasn't necessarily about convincing everyone.
No, it was about activating a committed base, giving voice to their frustrations, and then directing those frustrations toward specific political targets, often unions, government programs, or minority groups.
And part of that strategy, I think you mentioned, involved heavy use of anti-communist messaging. How effective was that, and how was it reinforced? I'm really curious about this group Campaigns, Inc. and those show trials that the sources mentioned. That sounds pretty dramatic.
Oh, anti-communist messaging was a key tactic, and yes, highly effective, especially in that Cold War climate. Groups like the Associated Farmers in California and the nascent PR industry back in the 1930s, they effectively, as the sources put it, helped to equate labor organizing with communism and civic disorder.
That's a powerful framing.
Extremely powerful. It was a potent rhetorical maneuver, leveraging the widespread fear of communism to demonize unions and workers' rights movements, framing them as a fundamental threat to American values, American stability. And this narrative was systematically reinforced by outfits like Campaigns, Inc., which is recognized as the first purely political campaign consultancy. They developed these messaging techniques into a systematic approach for political campaigns.
The first political consultants really honing this stuff.
Yes. And then you have the show trials. The sources mention these were based upon dubious accusations designed by experts and paid for by growers. So these weren't genuine legal proceedings. They were orchestrated spectacles. Political theater designed to intimidate and discredit opposition. It really exemplifies the lengths these elites would go to control the narrative and suppress dissent.
So this goes way beyond policy debates. This is about the sophisticated engineering of public opinion, the deliberate creation of fear and division. And that influence, those strategies, they didn't just disappear, they continued across generations. I think I read about the Koch family's involvement in the sources.
Absolutely. The sources provide clear examples of this intergenerational transfer of political values and strategies. A prominent example cited is how the Koch brothers learned political values and strategies from their father, Fred Koch, who was himself a wealthy and powerful founder of the John Birch Society.
Ah, the John Birch Society. Okay.
Yes. So this shows a direct lineage, a direct transfer of political and ideological approaches. The lessons learned in those early battles against the New Deal and labor movements were passed down, refined, and then applied by new generations of conservative elites. It's really a striking example of sustained, long-term strategic investment in a particular political agenda.
That really highlights how these tactics evolved over time. Speaking of evolution, the sources point to Ronald Reagan's political ascent as a prime example of how this authoritarian populism really matured as a strategy. How did his early political career sort of set the stage for this?
Well, Reagan's very vocal anti-communist stance during the McCarthy era, that laid the early groundwork for his political brand. It positioned him as this staunch defender against a perceived existential threat, both internal and external. He really built his initial public career on that foundation. He gained recognition and trust from a segment of the public that was deeply wary of perceived communist influences. This early shaping of his public persona proved absolutely crucial for his later successes. It established him as this decisive, principled figure within the conservative movement.
And then came that 1964 speech, A Time for Choosing, delivered in support of Barry Goldwater, the far-right Republican candidate then. How pivotal is that speech? What was its core message? And how did it manage to blend these different ideological streams into something new and powerful?
That speech, yes, A Time for Choosing, it was arguably a foundational moment, a real turning point. It articulated a vision where government was unequivocally framed as the problem, not part of the solution, the problem. And the solutions offered were unbridled market freedoms coupled with individual responsibility.
A clear contrast.
A very clear contrast. It wasn't just a political endorsement of Goldwater. It was really a philosophical manifesto. It was a direct retort to both Keynesian economics, which advocated for government intervention to manage the economy,
Right.
and of course communism, which represented total state control. This clear, decisive message resonated deeply with a segment of the population feeling increasingly alienated by big government, by complex social changes. It effectively set the stage for the rise of modern conservative thought by offering this clear, compelling alternative narrative.
So how did he then take that message, that philosophy, and apply it in his 1966 run for governor in California? How did he combine things like anti-Soviet zeal, U.S. patriotism, and white supremacy with what the sources refer to as Chicago school ideology? And what exactly were those racially coded terms he used? That sounds important.
Well, in that 66 governor's run, the sources contend that Reagan effectively, quote, whipped up anti-Soviet zeal, U.S. patriotism, and white supremacy into a glide toward Chicago school ideology. It was a masterful integration, really. He blended these powerful emotional appeals, anti-communism, patriotism, with an economic philosophy advocating minimal government intervention in free markets, the Chicago school approach.
In the racial element.
He deployed what the sources call racially coded terms for blacks, specifically mentioning the phrase, sending the welfare bums back to work.
The infamous welfare queen trope started around then too, didn't it?
Similar rhetoric, yes. It subtly but effectively tapped into racial resentments without using overtly racist language.
Yeah.
It's a tactic often referred to as racial dog whistling. And then, during the 1969 United Farm Workers grape boycott, a major labor action, he very publicly ate grapes live on television.
Wow. That's a statement.
A huge statement. It directly antagonized the union and its many supporters. It was a clear signal of his alignment with a powerful agricultural interest against the mostly Latino farm workers. And it served to appease and energize his base, which the sources describe as resentment-filled and largely white. It was a very calculated performance designed to reinforce his anti-labor, anti-welfare stance while appealing to this sense of national and racial grievance.
What's so fascinating and frankly a bit chilling is how masterfully he seemed to blend these different elements, the anti-communism, the fervent patriotism, the thinly veiled racial resentment, to energize that specific base. It really sounds like it became a powerful blueprint, a template for future populist leaders, showing how you could mobilize a segment of the population by tapping into this potent mix of economic anxiety, cultural fear, and perceived threats to national identity.
That's a key observation from the sources, yes. It was a template for building a broad coalition, characterized by resentment, largely white, that appealed to a very specific sense of American identity under threat.
Now, here's a concept I hadn't really come across before in this specific context. Productivism. Our sources identify it as a really crucial ideological thread. How exactly is it defined, and why is it so important to understanding this whole historical trajectory we're tracing?
Right. Productivism. As our sources define it, it's the doctrine that increased production is intrinsically desirable and that all parties benefit from increased output.
Mm-hmm.
Now, on the surface, that sounds, well, almost unassailable, doesn't it? Linked to progress, prosperity for all.
Yeah, more production sounds good, generally.
Generally.
Well,
However, the analysis in these sources reveals that its application in practice often masks deeper, much more complex and sometimes actively harmful consequences. It provided this powerful, seemingly neutral justification for policies that actually concentrated wealth and power, often at the direct expense of social equity or environmental concerns.
okay, so this seemingly benign idea actually, quote, contributed to validating authoritarian agendas in places like California and the Midwest. How did something that sounds so positive on its face end up enabling more authoritarian policies? That seems counterintuitive.
It's because the ideology allowed elites, particularly in the powerful agricultural sector, to justify policies that concentrated wealth and power, squeezing out small farmers, exploiting laborers, all under the seemingly neutral guise of efficiency and growth. If increased production is always the ultimate good, then any policy that boosts that output, regardless of its social cost or environmental impact, can be framed as universally beneficial.
Ah, I see.
It provided this really effective narrative cover for policies that were anything but universally beneficial. It subtly shifted the entire focus away from social welfare or worker well-being towards just raw output numbers.
And when you combine that with white rural identities, how did this ideology help, as the sources say, wedge Reaganism's pioneering neoliberalism into place nationally? It sounds like it created a very specific, powerful set of incentives.
Indeed, it did. The sources suggest that by combining this productivist ideology with appeals to white rural identities, it skillfully helped wedge Reaganism's pioneering neoliberalism into place nationally. There was this sort of underlying agreement fostered among elites, agricultural leaders, policymakers, that agriculture's primary goal was increased productivity above all else. This framework aimed, quote, to enable progressive farmers to modernize their way out of their problems.
Okay, what does that mean, modernize their way out?
It effectively steered farmers away from collective action, away from demanding government support programs like supply management. It framed their economic struggles not as systemic issues caused by policy, but as individual failures to modernize, to get bigger, get more efficient.
Get big or get out, basically.
That was the underlying message, yes. It presented this false choice. Modernize according to this specific corporate-friendly model or fail. It actively discouraged consideration of alternative economic or social structures that might have supported smaller farms or different agricultural models.
Can you give us a concrete example of how this actually played out in policy? What were the real-world implications for farmers and rural communities on the ground?
A really stark example cited in the sources comes from the Committee for Economic Development, the CED. Back in 1962, they proposed a plan to literally eliminate 1/3 of all U.S. farm families.
Eliminate them.
Move them off the land, push them into towns and cities. And these, quote, newly freed labor force members were then explicitly advertised to urban industries as being particularly docile.
Docile. Wow.
Yes, an Iowa Development Commission bulletin trying to lure industry to the state explicitly promised, and this is a direct quote, these Iowa ex-farm boys are just plain God-fearing sons of toil. They aren't radicals.
That's incredibly explicit. Chilling, actually.
It is, and the sources argue this is a clear example of a system designed to create a compliant, cheap labor pool by actively dismantling traditional agrarian life. And it was all presented as necessary for progress and productivity.
Unbelievable. And how did large corporations fit into this picture, particularly regarding those New Deal programs that were meant to help farmers?
Well, major corporations like Archer Daniels Midland, ADM, and Cargill were, according to the sources, instrumental in dismantling the New Deal's supply management programs. Remember, those programs had previously helped stabilize farm prices, often by controlling overproduction through government loans and land idling arrangements. They provided a crucial level of economic security for many farmers.
Right, managing supply to keep prices fair.
Exactly. But these programs were replaced. They were replaced with direct subsidies that primarily supported low prices for commodity purchasers, who benefited most from low prices.
The big corporate buyers like ADM and Cargill.
Precisely. The outcome, as our sources describe it, was clear. Corporate buyers could acquire commodity crops for record low prices that were subsidized by the federal government while farmers continued to lose their lands and their income. So, in essence, the federal government ended up subsidizing corporate profits while leaving many farmers in an increasingly precarious financial position.
The irony here is just palpable. This system, designed seemingly to benefit large corporations under the banner of productivism, actually created the conditions that led to a return of radical agrarianism in the 1980s. Farmers, many of them politically conservative, ended up adopting tactics of groups they once, quote, reviled as radical. Can you explain the American agriculture movement, the AAM, and their demands for parity pricing?
Exactly, the irony is stark. This very system, designed perhaps to create a compliant labor force and benefit large corporations, ended up creating such deep economic hardship that it fueled a powerful backlash from the farmers themselves. Farmers were facing ballooning production costs and plummeting commodity prices, largely due to the gutting of that federal supply management system we just discussed. So in 1977, they formed the American Agriculture Movement, the AM, and they made a radical pledge. They would stop buying supplies, stop selling their products, stop producing altogether, until Congress addressed farm prices through what they called parity pricing.
Parity pricing, what exactly is that?
Parity pricing is a concept aiming to ensure fair and stable prices for agricultural products. The goal is to provide farmers with enough income to cover their costs of production plus a reasonable profit, essentially ensuring their economic security relative to other sectors of the economy. And what's truly striking, as the sources emphasize, is that these farmers, often hailing from quite conservative backgrounds, adopted a confrontational approach of groups they once reviled as radical. They even started building relationships with striking labor unions.
Wow, talk about unlikely allies.
It was an alliance born out of shared economic struggle against incredibly powerful corporate and political interests. Necessity creating strange bedfellows, you might say.
That's a powerful historical echo. Does this struggle for parity, for fair prices, still hold relevance today? And are there efforts now to address some of the past exclusions, particularly the racial ones, within this kind of movement?
Oh, it absolutely holds modern relevance. The sources highlight that the return of parity to policy conversations after decades of being dismissed is really encouraging for progressive farmer organizations like the National Family Farm Coalition. They've long called for restoring supply management. As one Wisconsin dairy farmer quoted in the material put it, in politics until very recently, if you started talking about supply management, you'd be laughed out of the room.
Hmm.
So the fact it's back on the table is significant,
With caveats.
but with crucial caveats. It's seen as vital that the racialized blind spots and exclusions of old New Deal policy are actively addressed this time around. For instance, the original New Deal's agricultural and labor provisions were notoriously unevenly applied. They often excluded black farm workers, sharecroppers, and tenant farmers, preventing the formation of a truly unified resistance back then. So, this historical analysis calls for a much more intentionally inclusive approach to any policy reform today.
So this leads to projects like the one mentioned, updating parity for climate and justice, trying to learn from the past, build a broader, more inclusive movement for the future.
Exactly. That project specifically aims to build what they call a new hegemonic bloc. It does this by connecting traditional family farmer organizations with progressive think tanks and university academics. The goal is explicitly to revive and reimagine parity for the 21st century, ensuring that indigenous, black, and brown communities, who were often excluded before, are central to what they term a true just transition, one supported by climate scientists as well. It's really about leveraging those hard-learned historical lessons to build a more equitable, just, and ultimately more resilient agricultural system for everyone.
It's particularly striking, then, when you consider the cyclical nature of all this. The sources actually claim that, ironically, it is the ramifications of neoliberal policy that has propelled new authoritarian populists to power. How on earth did the very policies that were supposed to foster unbridled market freedoms end up creating the conditions for this new wave of populism? It seems like the opposite should have happened.
Well, the analysis presented in our sources suggests that the very policies designed to foster those unbridled market freedoms, policies prioritizing deregulation, free trade agreements, individual responsibility over collective action created conditions that left a massive void in many communities, especially rural communities. Think about it. The decline of those progressive rural movements we discussed, like the Farm Holiday Association, FHA back in the day, or the National Save the Family Farm Coalition more recently, meant that when economic hardship inevitably hit these communities hard,
Which it did under neoliberalism.
which it certainly did for many, there wasn't an organized, strong, left-leaning populist alternative ready to channel that discontent to offer different solutions.
So nature abhors a vacuum, as they say, and if a progressive movement couldn't fill that space left by economic despair, something else would step in. And in this case, the sources indicate it was white nationalism that moved into that vacuum, building a populist base for the repetition,
Right.
and ultimately contributing to Trump's ascendance.
That's precisely the argument laid out in the sources. The void created by widespread economic disaffection, coupled with the weakening of progressive countermovements, was, according to this analysis, effectively filled by appeals rooted in white nationalism. This movement successfully built a potent populist base for the fent, right, which significantly contributed to the major political shifts observed in recent years, including, yes, Trump's rise to power. And this occurred even as many farmers themselves were facing ballooning debt, consolidation pressures, and the negative impacts of free trade policies that pitted them against global competitors with lower costs or different subsidies, often leading to increased economic precarity right in the heartland.
So the grand promises of neoliberalism efficiency, growth trickling down, they just didn't materialize for many, especially in the agricultural sector and rural areas. And that deep economic insecurity, combined with a lack of viable progressive alternatives to articulate their anger, created fertile ground for a very different kind of populist appeal, one that often channeled those legitimate economic frustrations into cultural grievances, into scapegoating immigrants or minorities, basically redirecting anger away from the system itself. This really reveals a critical, maybe tragic, connection between deep-seated economic disaffection, particularly in communities feeling left behind by globalization, and the significant political shifts towards the kind of authoritarian populism we're discussing.
Indeed, it highlights a powerful and concerning feedback loop. Economic pain is expertly identified and then channeled into political movements that often promise overly simple solutions to incredibly complex problems. And frequently, as the sources detail, this is achieved by targeting perceived others, immigrants, racial minorities, cultural elites, and deflecting attention away from the systemic economic issues towards these cultural and racial grievances. Okay, so to recap this first chapter, our sources forcefully argue that authoritarian populism in the U.S. isn't some new invention or isolated event. Rather, it's best understood as a continuous refinement of strategies, with roots described as stretching back to settler colonial white supremacy. Its modern origins, according to the research, can be traced significantly to the post-New Deal reaction by a segment of the business class, particularly powerful agricultural growers in California who actively sought new ways to contain working-class struggle and maintain control. This period saw the development and deployment of sophisticated propaganda techniques, think tanks, targeted radio, intense anti-communist messaging, and also the leveraging of familial political legacies, like the Koch network example. Reaganism, these analyses suggest, represents a key maturation point. It skillfully blended anti-communism, fervent U.S. patriotism, and subtle but effective racialized appeals with Chicago school free market economic ideology, forging a powerful and enduring political coalition. Crucially, we also discussed the role of productivist ideology. While seeming benign, just focused on output, it actually contributed to validating authoritarian agendas in agriculture and shaped economic policies that, despite promises of broad benefit, often worsened economic disparities and fueled deep resentments among those left behind, like small farmers. And finally, the sources argue that the consequences of these neoliberal policies, the economic hardship, the hollowing out of communities, the weakening of progressive rural movements, ironically created the fertile ground that newer authoritarian populists have successfully exploited in recent times. So this whole trajectory, as presented in our sources, shows this persistent, adaptable effort over decades, even centuries, to mobilize specific segments of society, very often white voters, frequently by targeting perceived others and skillfully deflecting attention away from systemic economic problems towards cultural and racial grievances. End of chapter flashcard list. Authoritarian populism. Described in sources as a political phenomenon rooted in settler colonial white supremacy, characterized by continuously refined strategies to sustain power, often by mobilizing white resentment against non-white others. Manifest destiny. A 19th century doctrine asserting a divine right for U.S. expansion across North America. Sources suggest it contributed to a foundational God and country narrative, linked to hardship, dominion, and racial hierarchy. Productivist ideology. The belief, analyzed critically in sources, that increased production is inherently good for all, historically used to validate authoritarian agricultural agendas and prioritize output over farmer well-being or equity. Neoliberalism. An economic political philosophy favoring free markets, deregulation, individual responsibility. Sources argue its adoption led to economic consequences that ironically fueled new authoritarian populist movements. A Time for Choosing, 1964. Ronald Reagan's pivotal speech described as framing limited government as the problem and promoting unbridled market freedoms, seen as a defining moment in modern authoritarian populist rhetoric. American Agriculture Movement, AAM. A grassroots farmers movement formed in 1977, documented in sources as a response to gutted federal programs, advocating parity pricing and using confrontational tactics against agribusiness. Parity pricing. A concept aiming for fair agricultural prices to ensure farmers cover costs and earn a reasonable income. A key demand of progressive farmer groups highlighted in sources: Chicago school ideology, an economic school favoring minimal government, free markets, deregulation. Sources note its blending with anti-communism and white supremacy during Reagan's rise.
Okay, that sets a really comprehensive stage, ready for the next chapter.